Chapter 14, no, yes. Chapter 14 nearly makes up for everything. It's as if Walter Scott also thought he was dragging this out too much, having been so minute with respect to the diversions of Tully Veolan on the first days of Edward's arrival for the purpose of introducing its inmates to the reader's acquaintance. It becomes less necessary to trace the progress of his intercourse with the same accuracy, which means he's actually going to get on with the story at last. Although following the usual pattern, not very much happened in this chapter. A few things did happen. One is, when he woke up in the morning, he came across Davy, who it seems, Davy Gallatley, the half-wit, it seems as if Davy has this habit of communicating through song, not singing to somebody, but if they're in the general vicinity, something occurs to him about them and he sings a song about it. It did say in the last chapter that a lot of his songs come from his brother, who used to write them. He's a collector of little bits about songs. And seeing Edward this morning, he sings a song that Edward feels is directed at him, but he doesn't quite understand it. I have to admit, even knowing what's going on, I don't understand it. And even reading to the end of the chapter and going back, I'm not entirely sure what Davy is saying here. The theme of the song is young men versus old men. Edward tried to ask Davy what he meant, but he said nothing. So after that, Edward found Alexander Saunderson, the butler. And he found him yet again in the garden. Even though he's a butler, he's obviously very into gardening. This is his recreation, but he comes from a line of gardeners, so it's something he knows how to do. And it seems that they actually don't have a gardener at Bradwardine. This is Rose's garden that he is tending, kind of because he cares for Rose. So he's doing this for her, but he's doing this for her because there is no gardener. And that was the reason that he was embarrassed when Edward saw him before. He not so much embarrassed on his own account, but ashamed that the house of Bradwardine couldn't afford both a butler and a gardener. Alexander Saunderson tells Edward what we had figured out before, that Bally was kind of compelled to apologise by Tully, and that Bally and Tully had actually had a sword fight that morning, during which Bally's sword arm was injured, and that's why he went home. He actually had an injury in his sword arm. Edward isn't happy with this because he feels like he was the one that had the right to call Bally out, and that he should have done it, and Tully has usurped his prerogative. So he tracks down Tully to have it out with him and says, you shouldn't have done that, that was for me. Tully really impressed me here. I thought I understood what was going on, but I hadn't actually seen the full picture. What Tully did, he said, by insulting my guest he insulted me, therefore I did have the right to call him out, and I did that. But also, although Edward didn't pick this up, it looks as if Tully deliberately wounded Bally's sword arm because he knew that Edward wasn't going to accept anybody else having this fight with Bally. That Tully, as the Baron of Bradwardine, might have the right to call him out. That didn't change the fact that Edward also did. But he actually saved Bally by wounding him in his arm. Nobody can call out and fight a man who has a wounded sword arm. So that was really clever. I was impressed. And I hadn't seen that coming. The rest of the chapter is kind of about Rose and her situation. And here again, I kind of had it wrong. I sort of had it wrong. Edward sometimes found the Baron of Bradwardine a sort of dry, unimaginative person to have dealings with, but he enjoyed the company of Rose, which is exactly what I predicted, but not because he was falling in love with her. Rose is sweet and kind and intelligent and a good conversationalist. Her father gave her an education that's more generally given to men, so she could actually talk on the great works of literature and history and such things. She'd also read some religious tomes. There's a lot of things that she and Edward can talk about because her education kind of matched his. They knew a lot of the same stuff. And her opinion is worth having, it seems. Edward enjoyed her company and she enjoyed his, but he didn't actually fall in love with her. Because, Scott tells us, he's at an age where he's sort of looking for a goddess type character to fall in love with. He's young enough to want somebody grand and unattainable that he can like fall at the feet of. And Rose is just altogether too normal. So although she's quite attractive and appealing and sweet, she's not sexy. That's my reading of it. She's got no sex appeal, and she's not a flirt in any way. It hasn't even occurred to her to be a flirt. So Edward sees her as a little sister, but it's not the same for Rose. She's quite impressed with Edward, so she is here slowly falling in love with him, or at least falling into a crush. But because this has never happened to her before, she doesn't realise it's happening. She's spending a lot of time with him. He's sent back to the barracks for his books of poetry. She's never really come across poetry before. When his books are sent to him there, she's really into the poetry, to the point that she's neglecting everything else. She neglects her flower garden, and Sanderson notices this, that he's slaving away in her garden. She's not paying any attention. She's not coming and visiting it at all anymore. All of her old hobbies are gone. All she's doing is she's reading the poetry, she's reading the modern novels, and she's talking to Edward about them. While Edward, who is enjoying her company, just isn't seeing her as a woman at all. It also says that he's a bit embarrassed by what happened with Cecilia Stubbs, how he had built Cecilia into something she wasn't. And so he's a little bit wary of girls now, because he knows that he has this capacity to build them up. They might not be as they seemed. So that, coupled with the fact that he's just spending a lot of time in Rose's company and she's not flirting at all, means that he's just becoming very familiar with her. She's part of the furniture. She means nothing to him. And he doesn't see how he is affecting her. And then it goes on in this chapter to talk about her father and how he's given her a brilliant education. He cares for her deeply. She's hugely important to him, but he's never considered marrying her to anybody or setting her up for the future. Bradwardine Manor apparently is entailed on a male heir, so when the Baron of Bradwardine dies, she's going to be homeless unless she marries somebody wealthy. Mr. McWeedle, the Bailey, who was there the other day, has put some time into this. He actually consulted a lawyer on the matter who said that he thought the entail could be broken in her favour, but when McWeedle put that to the Baron said, no, it's got to go to the male heir. That's really important. Even for Rose, we can't change that. That's tradition. That's how it's got to be. So McWeedle is sort of working towards Rose marrying Bally, who is young, who has his own estate, who is of a suitable rank. His estates are only mildly encumbered. So that's not a brilliant match, but it's not bad. It'll keep her safe for the rest of her life. Her father, though, hasn't even thought about that, isn't considering Rose getting married at all, isn't thinking about her future at all. Maybe he is, and we're going to find out why later on, but at this point, that's what it says. He's not thinking at all about her future. I forgot one small point. Everybody but Tully is aware that Edward and Rose are spending a huge amount of time together, and most of the household is making the assumption that this is Tully's plan, that Tully has chosen Edward as a suitable husband for Rose, and he's therefore encouraging them to spend time together. So everybody else in the household is sort of giving them plenty of space and staying out of their way, and likewise encouraging this communication between the two. And they all approve, because Edward is the nephew of Sir Everard, who had saved Tully years ago, and they've been very good friends ever since. Sir Everard is an upstanding Jacobite man with a very good estate. So it seems perfectly logical to everybody that Tully would choose Edward as the future husband of Rose. Whereas the truth is that Tully still sees Rose as a little girl and hasn't put a second's thought into this. That is pretty much all that happens in this chapter, except that when Edward sent back to the barracks for his books, a letter came back with them. He was granted a little bit more leave, but the letter reminded him, without giving him any kind of advice, just reminded him that he is currently mixing with people who refused to take the oath of allegiance, and this isn't really a good look. And to remember how he got his commission in the first place. Also that he needed to be careful of the clergy he might meet out here because they are not espousing the true religion. Edward apparently was willing to consider these first few points, but when he got to that one, he felt that that was pure prejudice, so he felt that maybe the other points were also prejudice. Therefore, he has decided to continue as a guest at Bradwardine Manor, and that's everything that happened in chapter 14. Although it doesn't sound much and there wasn't very much action, it settled a whole lot of points, and at least we're now in a good position to move on with the story. In chapter 15 we finally have some development. Apparently now Edward has been there for 6 weeks, which, while I get that he's having a great time, and I know things were different in older days and longer stays were acceptable, that still seems like a hugely long time to stay there with somebody who he doesn't really know. He's obviously been made very welcome. They're quite happy to have him. But all the same, 6 weeks is almost bordering on moving in. That's not the case. I know that in England it was kind of common in country houses to invite people out for like a whole winter, the whole off London season. You'd go out and stay with somebody else. Like, this sort of thing did happen. But that was invited people. That was family, friends. There was more behind that than just showing up unexpectedly and not leaving. I'm also a bit surprised that his regiment can spare him for this long. I know it's peacetime, so I guess maybe the regiment are just, they don't know what to do anyway. Maybe they want people to go off and leave because at least they're not hanging around. Chances are they didn't have to pay him while he wasn't there. So maybe it's actually a good thing for everybody that he's off doing his own thing. Except, of course, that he's in Jacobite territory at the moment. But 6 weeks. Start there. He's been at Tully Veolan for 6 weeks. And they had a raid overnight. Some Highlanders came down and stole some cattle. This is the pivotal event of the entire chapter. Edward wakes up and realises that everybody's in a bit of a fuss. Everyone's too busy and too het up to tell him what's going on. It's Rose in the end that explains that the cattle were stolen. Everybody has their own idea about what to do. So some people want to go after them and get the cattle back. Edward suggested he go and fetch his regiment to go and get the cattle back and deal with the thieves. The story is they were paying protection money to a Highland lord. Sometime recently there was a quarrel between Tully and this lord, at which point they stopped paying protection money. So now that they're not being protected, that's why the Highlanders have come and stolen their cattle, and they have to decide what to do, because until recently what they would have done was just get in touch with this Highland lord and he would have got them back for them. They can't do that now because they've stopped paying. The money that they were paying is called blackmail, and the lord that they used to pay looks to me like he's going to be an important person in this story. We haven't met him yet. But just the fact that Scott has invested so much time in explaining who he is, it just comes across that way. Apparently this man and Tully were good friends. Tully didn't realise he was paying blackmail to him. It was his bailey who was actually paying the money kind of secretly. And Tully found out about it recently at a county meet and was so upset that he and the Highland Lord almost came to blows. Rose is sorry that this happened because apparently she was good friends with that lord's daughter, whose name is Flora, and she describes Flora as being beautiful and spirited, and apparently Flora grew up in a convent in France, so she's quite refined and educated as well as beautiful and spirited. This, of course, sounds like the perfect person for Edward to fall in love with, so I detect a developing love triangle. Interesting to see that this was a feature even in 1805. Of course, I don't know for sure that that's where it's going, but logically, that's what's going to happen. And that will be really hard on Rose. But that's just my guess, and I've been wrong before, so we'll see how it goes. In the meantime, we're hearing a bit about this man. This Highland Lord is named Fergus Machiva. He's known to the Highlanders as Vichian Vor, and Rose runs his name entirely together as Fergus Machiva Vichian Vor. Edward called him Mr. MacGyver at one point, and that was an interesting point too. Edward said, "And did you ever see this Mr. MacGyver, if that be his name, Miss Bradwardine?" And it's M.R. Mr. M.R. Rose answers, "No, that is not his name, and he would consider master as a sort of affront, only that you are an Englishman and know no better." I noted that M.R. which we know as Mr., she's saying master. Now I'm aware that Mr. is the honorific that means master, like master it used to be, but I just wonder if they were actually pronouncing it master at this point. It's entirely possible. The other thing I noticed in this chapter was at the beginning, when there was all this fuss and everyone was sort of running around, Davy Gallatley gets stirred up whenever there's a fuss of any sort going on, and he was skipping around singing some song. The Bailey, McWeeble, gave him a crack with his horsewhip. Happening to pass too near the Bailey, he received an admonitory hint from his horsewhip, which converted his songs into lamentation. And that just seems really cruel. He's just there skipping around, overexcited by all the fuss. He gets whipped with the horsewhip and he just sort of runs off crying. And nobody thinks any more of it. They're trying to decide. The Baron wants to get together a group of people to go and take the cattle back. Some of them want to start paying money, either buy the cattle back off the horse thieves or start paying MacGyver again. The Baron is dead set against this. The one other thing that happened was they arranged for the Bailey to send his own home cows down to serve the property, and the Bailey should send his own 3 milk cows down to the Mains for the use of the Baron's family, and brew small ale as a substitute for milk in his own. It seemed to be harsh to me. Don't really know much about the Bailey's personal circumstances. I don't know if he's got a wife and kids or anything like that. They haven't been mentioned. Oh, also in this chapter that is probably worth noting, Rose tells the story of a Highland raid that happened when she was 10, and how 3 Highlanders were killed and they were wrapped in their tartans on the doorstep until their families came to collect them, and how it had frightened her, and the sounds of the grieving women who came to collect them, and the pipes that played as they were carried out, and all of that. And Edward was sort of impressed by this, because it was very much like the kind of imaginings he'd had when he was back at Waverley Honour, thinking about his ancestors, Sir Hildebrand and Willibert and such. The days that he thought were well and truly in the past, that would never come again, and he's suddenly realised that those days are actually Rose's life. Not that that's made him view Rose any differently, but he's suddenly seeing his own circumstance and his own surroundings a bit differently, and he's looking at the people he's with slightly differently too. So to wind up, I guess that's really plenty that happened in this chapter. It flowed much better. I think Walter Scott is glad to get going at last on the story. Bradwardine Manor is in the Footlands, not actually in the Highlands, and since this story is, I think, more about the Highlands, Scott seems to be gearing up. I'm guessing they're actually going to head up into the Highlands, and that's where the bulk of this story will occur. So it does feel like things are moving at last, and I'm glad I've pushed through to this point. I'm going to try to read a few more chapters soon. I'm pretty tired. I'm actually on holidays, or I'm about to be on holidays. Today is Saturday, and yesterday was my last day at work before holidays, but holidays technically begin on Monday. And I'm on call all of this weekend, and I've already had 2 call-outs. So it's not real holidays, but I'm trying to get through this book as much as possible, because I'm going to go away for the week and I won't have my computer. I'll take my camera. I'm not sure how much time I'll have to read while I'm away. And I'll just explain that here in case this all sort of chops off all of a sudden. So while I am sorting this place out to do without me for a week, and continuing to be on call and working out what I'm taking with me and finishing my reading and recording and everything else that I'm doing. Here we are at 11 PM and I think we're still 30 Celsius. But it's going well. The book is getting interesting now. So we'll see what happens next chapter. Chapter 16. This is the real beginning of the story. I said the same about 10 chapters ago, I think around chapter 6 or 7, because I thought that was. But this is it. This is definitely the start. Everything that has gone before was set up in world building. In this chapter we meet another new character, but it's okay because he's a great character. I've known him for half a chapter and he's already my favourite in the whole book. And that is Machiva. I said Machiva in the last chapter, but honestly I think Machiva is how it was pronounced. So that's what I'm going to use from here on. This character arrived while they were all sitting at the table. I presume they were all sitting at the table because the chapter opens with the Baron returned at dinner time, and then they go on and have conversation. So I'm pretty sure they're sitting at the table, and I'm going to read it out because I think Walter Scott's grand entrance for Evan here is the best way to introduce him. The door suddenly opened, and ushered by Saunders Saunderson, who is Alexander Saunderson, Sanderson, Saunders, etc., ushered by Saunders Saunderson, a Highlander, fully armed and equipped, entered the apartment. Had it not been that Saunders acted the part of master of the ceremonies to this martial apparition, without appearing to deviate from his usual composure, and that neither Mr. Bradwardine nor Rose exhibited any emotion, Edward would certainly have thought the intrusion hostile. As it was, he started at the sight of what he had not yet happened to see, a mountaineer in his full national costume. The individual Gale was a stout, dark young man of low stature, the ample folds of whose plaid added to the appearance of strength which his person exhibited. The short kilt showed his sinewy and clean-made limbs. The goatskin purse, flanked by the usual defences, a dirk and steel-wrought pistol hung before him. His bonnet had a short feather, which indicated his claim to be treated as a... yeah, I'm going to mangle the Gaelic, right? Dwinhoisel, or sort of gentleman. A broadsword dangled by his side, a target hung upon his shoulder, and a long Spanish fowling piece occupied one of his hands. With the other he pulled off his bonnet, and the Baron, who well knew their customs and the proper mode of addressing them, immediately said with an air of dignity, but without rising, and much as Edward thought in the manner of a prince receiving an embassy, "Welcome, Evan du Macombish. What news from Fergus Machievavich Janvor?" And then we get a little bit of diplomatic stuff, because this guy's been sent as an envoy to try to make up the quarrel between Machiva and Bradwardine. "Fergus Machievavich Janvor," said the ambassador in good English, "greets you well, Baron of Bradwardine and Tully Veolan, and is sorry there has been a thick cloud interposed between you and him, which has kept you from seeing and considering the friendship and alliances that have been between your houses and forebears of old." And on he goes to say effectively, let's not worry about who started this, can we put an end to it? To which the Baron of Bradwardine answered, with a bit more preamble, he was sorry there should have been a cloud between him and any gentleman of such sound principles, for when folks are banding together, feeble is he who hath no brother. With that, the quarrel's made up. Basically, Evan is here, if they make up the quarrel, to collect the owing blackmail and then to go and bring the cattle back. So they all have a drink. This is what happens to seal a pact. Then the envoy retired to adjust with Mr. Merkweeble some subordinate articles with which it was not thought necessary to trouble the Baron, which is clearly the paying of the blackmail. Edward goes with them, kind of I think because he's fascinated by Evan and he wants to see more of him and what he's doing, which is excellent for the story, but I don't know. I don't think it shows Edward in a very mature light, that he's just going to tag along like a kid and see what's going on when they're doing this sort of diplomatic business. But it's fine, apparently. Our hero, who had attended Evan Dhu during his perquisitions, was much struck with the ingenuity which he exhibited in collecting information and the precise and pointed conclusions which he drew from it. Evan Dhu, on his part, was obviously flattered with the attention of Waverley, the interest he seemed to take in his inquiries, and his curiosity about the customs and scenery of the Highlands. Without much ceremony, he invited Edward to accompany him on a short walk of 10 or 15 miles into the mountains and see the place where the cattle were conveyed to, adding, "If it be as I suppose, you never saw such a place in your life, nor ever will unless you go with me, or the like of me." With that line and with Edward's acceptance of the invitation, we've got the proper start of the story. Not only do we have an action, but we've got an objective. Admittedly, it's only an objective to get some cattle and bring them back, but this is the first time we've seen that. And it already makes it a far more palatable story. They pack a bag for Edward and assign him a deputy gamekeeper who is actually going to carry that bag. Edward doesn't even have to carry his own luggage. So as they walk, Evan and Edward talk. Evan was accompanied by a couple of Highlanders, and he tells Edward it would have been rude to come on his own, that he needed to have attendance due to the dignity of the Baron of Bradwardine. The attendants don't speak much English. They're also in full Highland gear. They're also armed. It's kind of clear to the reader, although obviously not to Edward, who's particularly dense, that if things hadn't worked out, they were ready to fight. But things did work out, so it's fine. Now, Rose isn't happy that Edward is going. Not that she's said anything, but apparently she's turned pale at the idea because she's worried about him. They're telling him he's safe. Scott makes it kind of clear that there are different definitions of safe. So maybe Edward isn't as safe as he thinks he is. But they set off and they walk for miles and miles. The countryside is described. They're going into the mountains. They're sort of going into ravines and over rocks, and once again very Tolkien type descriptions, very Tolkien like terrain. With tales of the grandeur of the chief, Evan Dhu beguiled the way until they approached more closely those huge mountains which Edward had hitherto only seen at a distance. Towards evening they entered one of the tremendous passes which afford communication between the high and low country. The path, which was extremely steep and rugged, winded up a chasm between two tremendous rocks, following the passage which a foaming stream appeared to have worn for itself in the course of ages. A few slanting beams of the sun, which was now setting, reached the water in its darksome bed, and showed it partially chafed by 100 rocks, and broken by 100 falls. The descent from the path to the stream was a mere precipice, with here and there a projecting fragment of granite, or a scathed tree which had warped its twisted roots into the fissures of the rock. On the other hand, the mountain rose above the path with almost equal inaccessibility, but the hill on the opposite side displayed a shroud of copsewood, with which some pines were intermingled. And I read that out just to show how much it's like Lord of the Rings terrain. Here they are, traipsing through the rocks. It's almost impenetrable. It's only penetrable to those who know the way. Evan points to some eagle way, way, way up high, and he sends a slug after him. His plan was to impress Edward with his marksmanship, but he actually misses. He's a bit embarrassed about that and just carries on silently for a bit, which is sort of a nice touch of humanity for our Evan Dhu. The description goes on, and then they get to a bog. Once again, it's just like Lord of the Rings. A black bog of tremendous extent, full of large pit holes, which they traversed with great difficulty and some danger, by tracks which no one but a Highlander could have followed. The path itself, or rather the portion of more solid ground on which the travellers half walked, half waded, was rough, broken, and in many places quaggy and unsound. Sometimes the ground was so completely unsafe that it was necessary to spring from one hillock to another, the space between being incapable of bearing the human weight. This was an easy matter to the Highlanders, who wore thin-soled brogues fit for the purpose, and moved with a peculiar springing step, but Edward began to find the exercise, to which he was unaccustomed, more fatiguing than he expected. The lingering twilight served to show them through this Serbonian bog, but deserted them almost totally at the bottom of a steep and very stony hill, which it was the travellers' next toilsome task to ascend. Very picturesque, very romantic. They go up the hill, travel a bit more. Evan heads off to speak to this person who they're going to. His name is Donald Beanleen. I don't know how they pronounce it. I mean, given that Sean is S-E-A-N, maybe it's Bornlawn. Donald Bornlawn? I don't know. Anyway, that is the chieftain person they're going to who has stolen Bradwardine's cattle. At this point the party splits up because Evan doesn't want to take Edward there because he is what he calls a Sidier Roy, or red soldier. So there you go, he's wearing red. Because he is a Hanoverian soldier and this is purely Jacobite territory. Edward is the enemy. It's kind of interesting that Evan brought him actually, but Edward is the enemy, and so he and one of Evan's men wait behind while the rest of them go on to talk to Donald Bornlawn. Edward's a little bit disconcerted by this. He's a tiny bit worried that maybe he's just about to be killed and robbed, but that doesn't happen. The soldier who's been left behind with Edward speaks very poor English, so Edward does try to ask him a few things, but there's not really much conversation. The man leads him to the edge of a lake, and there they sit. And while they're sitting there, it all sort of dawns on Edward that this is exactly the kind of exciting stuff that he used to daydream about, and he's actually finally in one of these battles. And as it says here he sate on the banks of an unknown lake, under the guidance of a wild native, whose language was unknown to him, on a visit to the den of some renowned outlaw, a second Robert Hood perhaps, or Adam O'Gordon, and that at deep midnight, through scenes of difficulty and toil, separated from his attendant, left by his guide. What a variety of incidents for the exercise of a romantic imagination. The only circumstance which assorted ill with the rest was the cause of his journey, the Baron's milk cows. This degrading incident he kept in the background. A boat comes across the lake very, very silently. There's a whistle. His Highland companion whistles in return. The boat comes up to them. They get in and off they go rowing across the lake in the dead of night, and he can't see a thing around him. And that's the end of that chapter. To me, that's the best chapter of the book. Something actually happened. They've got action, they've got an objective. We're seeing what Edward thinks. We're placed beautifully in this scene, visually and emotionally. And we as the reader know what to hang on to. I'm presuming the attention that's been placed in describing Evan Dhu, that he is going to continue to be a main character as well. And it does seem like Evan and Edward have clicked, they're friends. So it's all in a very good place. I can't help wondering though how this ties in with the earlier parts of the story. I'm still holding in my head a whole lot of stuff like Bally, who insulted him earlier. I presume that's going to come back at some point. And what about Colonel Gardner of his regiment, who suddenly changed from being the playboy into being the serious one? I'm waiting for that to call back as well. There's so much going on at the sides. But we've got some firm action. This is great. I won't complain about this. I'm actually looking forward to reading more.